Rosana Galliano was having dinner with her sister Monica in the living room of her house in El Remanso, Exaltación de la Cruz, when her phone rang. It was her husband, Jose Arce, calling to say he was running late to pick up their sons, Geronimo and Nehuen, ages 4 and 3. Rosana answered the call, but, struggling to hear, stepped out into the garden to talk. As she tried to communicate with Jose, a figure emerged from the trees, took a few steps toward her, and pulled out a gun. The assailant fired 6 shots, leaving 29-year-old Rosana's body just steps from her home, struck by 4 bullets. Rosana Galliano was born in the late 1970s in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She was the youngest child, with 2 brothers named Oscar and Gustavo, and a sister named Monica. Her parents were Reynaldo and Graciela. The details of her childhood and teenage years are a bit of a mystery, but it's known that she finished high school in the late 90s. During this time, Rosana's dad, Reynaldo, worked as a mechanic. Early in 2001, Jose Arce showed up at Reynaldo's workshop. Jose was born on November 22, 1948. He had lived abroad for over 30 years, in places like Greece and the United States, where he even spent 4 years in prison for drug trafficking. Eventually, Jose returned to Argentina in 1996, owning 8 properties in a posh area of Buenos Aires. Jose and Rosana met when he brought his vintage car for repairs at her father's shop. Despite the significant age difference, they started dating quickly. At that time, Rosana was unemployed and quite reserved. Jose appeared to be financially stable, but in reality, his wealth came from his mother, Elsa, who was still in the United States. When Jose, at the age of 52, proposed to 22-year-old Rosana, her mother Graciela questioned if he was too old for her daughter. Jose argued that love knew no age. Looking for assurance, Graciela turned to Rosana, who, in a whisper, confirmed her desire to marry him. The couple got married on November 17, 2001, after just 7 months of dating. Jose claimed that his cheerful, modern, and smart personality won Rosana over. Soon after, they had a son named Geronimo. But not long after, problems began to show. Jose was a controlling and jealous man who often belittled Rosana and her family. This abuse eventually became physical, leaving Rosana feeling trapped and fearful. Jose's intimidating presence, reinforced by owning 2 guns, ensured he kept control, a situation that Rosana's family was painfully aware of. It was common for Jose to show off his guns, either when someone visited their home or when he was out visiting others. One time, while painting their house, Rosana's brother Oscar witnessed Jose physically assaulting her, telling her to shut up before hitting her. On another occasion, her father noticed bruises on Rosana's back, and she simply told him that Jose had dragged her across the pavement. Despite these troubles, Rosana and Jose welcomed their second child, and Rosana tried her best to make the relationship work, hoping to provide a stable home for their children. However, her efforts were constantly undermined by Jose's temper and disrespectful behavior. To make matters worse, Jose's mother, Elsa, controlled the household from afar, making decisions about their lives during her short visits to Argentina. By 2006, Rosana had endured unbearable abuse and finally reported Jose for domestic violence. Her family was largely unaware of the full extent of her suffering. Months later, Rossana filed a second complaint, including a request for a medical examination due to her injuries. Following this, she opened up to her sister Monica, and they made a pact to communicate whenever something happened. Monica became her sanctuary and support. Whenever life with Jose became unbearable, Rossana would visit Monica's apartment with her children, though Jose dictated when they must return, often with death threats. At times, he verbally abused Rossana, criticizing her abilities as a mother. Eventually, she decided to move in with Monica and the children, while Jose stayed at his house. After some time, Rossana filed another complaint and sought a divorce, resulting in a restraining order against Jose. They only met at a neutral property in El Remanso, Exaltación de la Cruz, for child visitation, as arranged by the court. It was there that Rossana shared the extent of her ordeal with the gardener. Daniel Gonzalez, who lived nearby, was married and had a daughter. Rumors suggested a secret romance between Rossana and Daniel, but this was never confirmed. Jose's threats continued, and Rossana even played a voicemail for her brother Oscar in which Jose talked about killing her. In mid-2007, while hanging out with friends at a bar, Rossana met Oscar Lugo. He was 32, lived in Marino, and worked in a sewing workshop. They hit it off immediately, exchanged numbers, and started dating. Oscar Lugo was old-fashioned, a gentleman who was kind, attentive, and listened to her. For 29-year-old Rossana, who had been through endless turmoil, it felt like she was rediscovering a nearly forgotten life. Oscar Lugo noticed Rossana's lack of confidence and the fear in her. By December 2007, he had joined her for the holiday festivities, even dressing up as Santa Claus to delight her sons. But the happiness was marred by Jose, who kept tabs on Rossana's every move. Aware of her new relationship and panicked by the looming divorce, Jose called Rossana, offering her a truck to end things with Oscar Lugo. She refused, and it was her new boyfriend who accompanied her to the hospital during a severe nervous breakdown. Out of options, Jose hatched a plan, financed by his mother, Elsa. They meticulously arranged to hire a hitman, whose identity remains a mystery. On January 16, 2008, Rossana and her sister Monica went to El Remanso to pick up her sons, age 4 and 3. The handover was delayed by Jose with excuses. At 9:15 p.m., Jose called, claiming Geronimo had a fever and he would take him to the hospital and return him the next day. However, Rossana insisted on having the children back to care for Geronimo herself. The call was brief, and then she went inside. Around 9:53 p.m., Rossana texted Oscar Lugo with a casual message about their plans for the next day. At 10 p.m., Rossana and Monica sat down for dinner. At 10:50 p.m., Jose called again, and this conversation turned into a deadly trap. Rossana went out to the garden for better reception, where a shadowy figure emerged from behind the trees and shot her 4 times with a .45 caliber gun. Hearing the shots, Monica screamed, saw Rossana stagger and collapse. Frantic, Monica tried calling 911 without success, then asked her boyfriend to alert the police. Meanwhile, Oscar Lugo, unaware of the events, tried contacting Rossana at 11 p.m. and, failing that, tried to reach Monica but got no response. Police investigations revealed that the shooter had entered from an adjacent vacant lot. A witness saw someone fleeing through a gap in the fence but couldn't provide a clear description due to the darkness. That night, Jose was questioned and appeared shocked. After requesting a lawyer, he let the lawyer handle the proceedings and left. The next day, during further searches, a red sweater was found, which Roxana's relatives believed belonged to Jose, making him the prime suspect in their eyes. The case grabbed media attention and shocked the country, becoming scandalous as Jose and his mother publicly claimed his innocence and talked bad about Roxana, suggesting she had multiple lovers and those men should be investigated instead. After the incident, Daniel, the gardener, became reclusive, speaking to no one. On the night of Roxana's funeral, Reynaldo noticed Jose nearby in a truck, watching from a distance without joining or expressing condolences. Jose's defense later targeted Monica, Roxana's sister and the sole witness, raising doubts about her by questioning why there were no bloodstains on her clothes and why she ran for her phone instead of helping her sister. However, this theory was unsupported. The investigators argued the weapon was too heavy for a woman to manage. An important point raised by the detectives was that anyone familiar with the house would know Roxana needed to go outside to get a cell signal, indicating significant premeditation in the crime. During the investigation, Roxana's sons were cared for by their father and grandmother Elsa, while their grandmother Graciela could see them. However, Monica and Oscar were denied access, with Jose claiming serious safety concerns for his sons. Despite the legal restrictions, the children expressed a desire to see their Aunt Monica, leading Jose to occasionally allow visits. Monica used these opportunities to take them to a psychologist. Eventually, Graciela obtained visitation rights, though not guardianship. In an interview at the time, Jose alleged that Roxana had 4 lovers, all with legal troubles. According to Jose, Roxana was intimate with these men to uncover their secrets, which she then used to blackmail them for benefits. Meanwhile, after receiving threats, Oscar was made a protected witness in his sister's case, requiring him to wear a tracking bracelet and being assigned police protection. As 2007 was ending, the investigators had yet to find solid evidence to charge any of the suspects. However, a significant turn came a year after the murder when Jose was arrested in January 2008, charged with aggravated homicide due to their relationship, premeditation, and the involvement of 2 or more people. The preliminary hearings began on January 28, 2008. Reynaldo, Graciela, Monica, and Oscar testified about Jose's repeated threats, violent nature, and use of firearms for intimidation. The mother also presented the last text messages from her daughter to the prosecutor. After the hearing, Reynaldo expressed feeling a heavy burden but found relief in fulfilling his duty to his daughter's memory. The next day, Oscar Lugo, Roxana's former boyfriend, testified against Jose, describing him similarly to the family's view. He mentioned Jose's attempts to tarnish his and Roxana's reputations, adding that Roxana believed Jose's claims of her having multiple lovers were a tactic to discredit her in their impending divorce. Jose's lawyer downplayed the allegations of Jose's emotional instability and aggression, suggesting they were echoing Roxana's narrative. On February 7, 2008, a 12-hour investigative session took place, with Jose's mother traveling from the United States for her turn to testify. Meanwhile, a new search at El Remanso yielded no new evidence. By then, Roxana's family suspected her mother-in-law's involvement in the plot. As a result, Reynaldo and Graciela's lawyer considered requesting her arrest. In defense, Jose and his mother's lawyer argued that Jose's mother had stated in her testimony that she bought houses for her grandchildren, believing the divorce settlement would not harm them. It was also added that it was untrue that Jose's mother and Roxana had a bad relationship. The media continued to debate the circumstances of Roxana's death and the notion that Jose orchestrated the murder, hinting at another perpetrator. Despite the suspicions, Jose was released on bail and took care of his children. Later, the court deemed the police protection for Oscar, Rosana's brother who worked as a taxi driver, unnecessary. On the early morning of July 5, 2008, Oscar was attacked by two armed men. They beat and threatened him for an hour before abandoning him in a vacant lot, where he was found thanks to his protective witness tracking bracelet. Though not severely injured, he was deeply shaken. Amidst the grief of losing Rosana and the ongoing custody battle, the family faced renewed fear, a fear that was palpable and justified. With no one convicted and ongoing threats, the demand for justice grew more urgent, yet the judicial system's slow pace was disheartening. Years passed, and by 2012, the trial and custody dispute dragged on. 4 years after the attack, Oscar used his visitation rights to take his nephews to play soccer, sharing a memorable hug with the 6- and 7-year-old boys. In April 2013, the oral trial started. Jose maintained his innocence. In May, proceedings were delayed when Jose suffered a stroke, pushing the final verdict to November 2013. The judges found that the murder was meticulously planned, resembling organized crime. Jose and Elsa were implicated in choosing the time and place for the attack, knowing that a phone call would lure Rosana outside, making her vulnerable. The court found financial motives behind the murder, as Jose did not want to split the marital assets. Jose and Elsa were sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction was upheld by the higher court, highlighting Jose's threats, the domestic violence endured by Rosana, and the dominant influence of his mother. The actual shooters were never identified. In 2015, Jose and Elsa received house arrest, Jose due to his health and Elsa due to her age, allowing the kids to live with them again. The media continued to cover the children's story for years, during which time Monica and Graciela had no contact with them. The boys shuffled between homes known to their father but strangers to Rosana's family. In the second week of January 2017, the court allowed the children to spend a weekend with their maternal grandparents for the first time. The Galiano family prepared their home with fresh paint, a thorough cleaning, and decorations. They hung balloons and made a colorful welcome sign. Graciela prepared their favorite dish. That weekend, the Galiano home was filled with joy as the boys played soccer, video games, and even asked to sleep in their grandmother's bed, whom they hadn't seen in over 2 years. On November 24, 2018, Jose died after another stroke. The event was another blow for the children, who attended their father's funeral. During the funeral, they expressed their concern about their future with their Aunt Monica. She assured them with calmness and love, promising to support whatever they decided. They chose to live with Monica, who then had to confront Elsa to communicate the boys' decision. Through these and many other instances, it was clear that Monica always acted in alignment with her nephew's wishes, whether they wanted to talk or preferred silence. Monica's primary goal was to provide stability and comfort for the boys. In March 2019, Geronimo chose not to change schools since he was close to his friends and had 2 years left there, so he went back to live with his grandmother Elsa. Meanwhile, Monica sought custody of the other kid. Things seemed to be stabilizing, but in the last week of November 2019, 87-year-old Elsa was moved from her home to the hospital, where she passed away on November 30th. The following month, Monica was granted custody of Nahuen. By year's end, Geronimo moved in with a friend of his grandmother. Both brothers continued to need psychological support to process their experiences, with Geronimo struggling with depression. Their psychologist noted the overwhelming succession of events they faced. In March 2020, Just before pandemic restrictions started, the person Geronimo was living with passed away, leading him to seek refuge with his Aunt Monica until October 2020. Upon turning 18, Geronimo rented a small apartment and lived independently, supported by income from his inherited properties. Monica began legal proceedings to secure their inheritance, fearing they might be deprived of their assets. Naywen, meanwhile, showed emotional stability thanks to the support he received and was encouraged to return to therapy whenever needed. And so, dear viewers, this concludes today's episode of Unreal True Crime. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you appreciate my work. Good night and see you in the next crime story. Traveling through a trail for 2 hours, the police reached the location. Arcadio Alvarez was found in a sugarcane field. It was at that moment that they apprehended the suspect, who was accused of committing incest for about 30 years against his eldest daughter, Alba Nidia, with whom he had at least 14 children, of which 8 survived. Very little is known about the childhood and youth of Arcadio Alvarez. We know that at some point during his youth, he formed a relationship with a woman whose identity has not been disclosed, and with whom he had a daughter. It appears that his partner died in 1979, and he was left to care for the little girl, who was then 5 years old. The girl's name was Alba Nidia Alvarez, who later became known as Nidia. After the death of his life partner, Arcadio moved into the home of a relative, an aunt of Nidia's, though it was unclear whether she was his sister or the sister of his deceased wife. However, a few years later, Arcadio began to encounter problems in that house, which is unsurprising, as the man started to abuse his daughter. This inappropriate behavior began when she was 5 years old. When she was around 13 years old, Nidia gave birth to her first baby, a boy who was also her brother. For her, this situation was always a tragedy, but her father was indifferent to it. They eventually settled with his family in a small village very far from everything in the south of Colombia, where only the most basic services were available. There were barely 200 families living in the area. Arcadio was a farmer with very few resources. As a result of his precarious economic situation, upon arriving at the place, he settled his family in a fragile and unstable wooden house with a zinc roof and dirt floors. It is noteworthy that by the time Arcadio arrived in that area, the family had 4 children. For the people of the region, initially, nothing seemed too strange. They simply saw the newcomers as good people, even though they were not very sociable or communicative. Nidia was a very reserved young lady and did not socialize with the local residents. In fact, she never left the house unless she was with her father, and she was essentially only seen when going out to buy supplies for the family alongside Arcadio. Some were concerned that she was school-age but did not attend the public school in the town. However, they never inquired about the reasons why the father did not send her to school. One day, reality struck everyone when it became evident that Nidia was pregnant. If she didn't leave the house, didn't have a boyfriend, and her father exercised complete control over her eldest daughter, the only possible conclusion was that the young girl, while a minor, was being abused by her father. But even though the abuse situation was clear to everyone, no one spoke. By the time Nidia was over 20 years old, she had had 11 pregnancies, not all of which came to term, and not all of the babies born survived. Nydia never gave birth in a hospital. It was often up to someone else to help her bring into the world the children fathered by Arsadio. In the small town, everyone gossiped about this. Initially, they were horrified, but nobody said anything. Of the 14 children Arsadio and his daughter Nydia had, in the end, only 8 survived, 3 girls and 5 boys. Only Nydia learned to read and write because her father taught her. The rest had all their rights violated, starting with the right to an identity, since they were never legally registered. It was as if they did not exist. Without an essential document like the birth certificate, they could never enroll in the small local school that around 80 children attended, nor were they vaccinated or treated at the local clinic. Local inhabitants later reported that they saw the irregular couple when they went out shopping and never noticed any affectionate relationship between them. Some neighbors claimed they had the chance to talk with Nydia, but instead of offering help or some kind of support to get out of the situation in which she was the victim, they blamed her. They told her that having intimacy and children with her father was not right. Her response was always to remain silent. No one ever dared to confront Arsadio or reproach his misconduct. Later, some neighbors claimed that while he seemed like a decent man, he was extremely serious, and the people feared he might do something to them. Over time, the forbidden carnal relationship between relatives became something everyone started to accept as normal in the locality. Apparently, on a few occasions, the Alvarez's home was visited by personnel from the local Secretary of Education and the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, as well as representatives of the Catholic and evangelical churches. The goal of all was to motivate the parents to send the kids to school, but this never had any effect. To make matters worse, these organizations also failed to pay attention to the fact that the children were not legally registered. It seemed that at that moment, the wind was blowing in Arsadio's favor. However, Arsadio pushed the limits too far, and that was the beginning of the end of his sinister plan of subjugation and abuse to the detriment of his entire family. As Nydia later recounted, her father began to show interest in perpetuating his deviant behavior with at least one of his granddaughters, who was around 11 years old. And as if his immoral behavior wasn't enough, he began to insinuate to his older male children that they could do the same. This undoubtedly set off alarms for Nydia, and it could be said that a divine intervention paved the way to the end. Around that time, Orlando, a pastor from the Pentecostal church, spoke to those present at one of his sermons, including Arsadio, who wanted to appear as a correct and faithful man, about the topic of incest and what it meant, labeling it as a terrible sin. This was a turning point in Nydia's life, who, at the end of the meeting, approached the pastor to ask him to pray for her. But the stars were aligning, as around that time, the world learned about the terrible case of Elisabeth Fritzl in Austria, whose father, Joseph Fritzl, kept her captive in the basement of his own house for 24 years, fathering 7 children with her. The case of Elisabeth was so shocking that it seemed people around the world were willing to prevent such situations from being repeated. It was this story that propelled Nydia to make a definitive decision. Also, religious conviction that her father was forcing her to commit a sin, and the fear that one of her daughters could become a victim of the same man added to the need to protect her descendants from the father's brutal assaults. The man, who always had a hellish temperament, beat one of his 6-year-old sons for waking him from his nap by fighting with one of his sisters. That, apparently, was the last straw. At that moment, Nydia confronted her father who, as he always had, reacted by hitting her. This was the strategy the man had used for years to ensure obedience through fear. But this time was different. Fueled by rage and courage, Nydia fought back, something that surprised Arsadio. Nydia knew she had no other option but to leave that house. For that, she not only gathered courage but also had the full support of her older daughters. Trusting in God's will and with the strength gained from her conversations with the pastor at the first opportunity, Nydia took her 6 youngest children and fled the humble house that had been her prison. The 2 oldest male children, 18 and 16 years old at that time, chose to stay with their father. The group left and headed to a nearby town, where Nydia took some time to settle her family before formally filing a complaint against her father with the authorities. Initially, she only dared to accuse him of having beaten her young son, but later she expanded the complaint to detail the years of abuse she herself had been a victim of. Clearly, before taking any action, the authorities had to conduct an investigation to corroborate the serious accusations Nydia had made. Meanwhile, her 6 children depended solely on her, and they were in a different town where rent had to be paid. But if there was something Nydia was an expert at, it was working hard, so it didn't take too long before she found a job at a local restaurant. She worked exhausting shifts, starting at 5 in the morning and finishing at 8 at night. She devoted 15 hours of her life daily, from Sunday to Sunday, to the demanding job that barely earned her 7,000 pesos, less than $4 at that time. In the meantime, her eldest daughter, 16 years old, took care of her siblings and became the most important support for the suffering mother. However, the authorities who heard Nydia did not make much effort to investigate what happened, and valuable time was lost for the woman and her children in terms of receiving the support they were justly entitled to from the Colombian state. The first to take real action on the complaint was a family commissioner who, seeing that the case was not being properly addressed, decided to send the information to Hugo Parra, a close collaborator of a counselor. Months had passed after the first complaint was made when Hugo, representing the counselor, arrived at the house occupied by Nydia and her children to learn firsthand what had happened. The man was completely shocked. As Hugo later told the media that covered the story, Nydia and her children were living in extreme poverty. The house they inhabited was in terrible condition, lacking clean water. The smell was almost unbearable. And of Nydia, only her shadow remained, as the 35-year-old woman looked almost 70. At that moment, it was decided to make the case public knowledge and to start a strict follow-up of the progress of the complaint. The following months were dedicated to gathering testimonies that would attest to the truthfulness of Nydia's accusations. Finally, in January 2009, it was considered that there were sufficient elements to present the case to the General Attorney of the nation. Immediately, the highest authority of the public ministry ordered a group of detectives to start investigating the facts officially and in depth. The impunity that Arsadio had enjoyed came to an end on March 27, 2009. That day, agents of the investigation team, known by its initials as CTI, initiated an operation to capture the alleged perpetrator. They had to travel 2 hours through intricate paths to reach the sugarcane plantation where Arsadio was known to be. Finally, the 58-year-old man was detained. In his initial statement to the authorities after being arrested, Arsadio maintained that he had never forced Nydia to engage in inappropriate sexual relations and also asserted that she was not his biological daughter but had been adopted. Needless to say, he also denied having intentions of abusing his daughters, much less having instigated his older sons to do so. Upon hearing her father's statements, Nydia affirmed that he used the same argument of her supposed adoption to abuse her. She added that her father subjected her to the most terrible treatments, besides having her practically imprisoned since she lived locked up and could not go anywhere unless it was with him. Among everything, perhaps the most surprising was when she claimed that he would always be her father and as such, she had to respect him. She then detailed that she always maintained in her conversations with Arsadio, when trying to reason with him, that she loved him as a father and never saw him as a man. On March 28, 2009, the trial against Arcadio Alvarez took place. There, the abuser maintained his version that Nidia was not his biological daughter but an adopted one, and stated that the two had agreed to love each other. What he could not explain was how he could have made such an agreement with a girl of 5 years old, which was the age she was when he violated her for the first time. Following this hearing, Arcadio was transferred to the local jail amidst a crowd gathered at the courthouse gates to shout insults at the abuser. The police had to act quickly to remove him from the place, as many in the crowd wanted to physically assault him. The detainee was charged with sexual abuse, violent carnal access, and incest against his daughter Alba Nidia Alvarez. By that time, the case had become well known, and the press had given it full attention. Despite everything Nidia had suffered, she showed her enormous heart as a mother during her conversation with journalists. She always stated that her greatest fear during all those years of subjugation was that her children might become victims of assaults like she was. Nidia maintained that this was something she never allowed, and she also stated that every interaction with her father made her feel very bad, and she did not want the story to repeat with her daughters, a point she had made very clear to Arcadio, warning him that if he ever laid a hand on any of her daughters, that would be the end of the docile and good person he had known. She hinted in her interaction with the media that she also resented that what was happening to her was an open secret and no one offered her the least bit of support. She confirmed that she never gave birth in a health center. All her childbirths were attended by midwives at home who knew the situation, but only asked if the new baby was the child of the same father. By that time, her oldest child was 19 years old, and the youngest was only 1 year old. In 2009, the trial against Arcadio ended, with no further details found, except, of course, that in response to the accused's claims that Nidia was not his biological daughter, comparative DNA tests were ordered. The Colombian Institute of Forensic Sciences confirmed that the man was lying, as the tests proved she was indeed his daughter. It was also revealed that the prosecution originally tried to add an additional charge for sexual acts against a minor under 14 years of age for an alleged abuse against one of his daughters, but the fact could never be proven, and in the end, the prosecution dropped this charge. The media reported that in the initial session, Arcadio pleaded innocent, but after 12 hours of hearing, Nidia's valuable testimony, and the DNA evidence, the accused ended up accepting the charges against him and even apologized to his daughter and his grandchildren. With his admission of guilt in October 2009, the presiding judge sentenced Arcadio Alvarez to 15 years and 7 months in prison, a sentence that undoubtedly seemed almost an offense to the victims and did not take into account the number of people whose lives were severely affected. And there was yet another incomprehensible detail. Although the reasons were not found, the sentence was later reduced to 11 years, 7 months, and some days. After the trial and under the protection of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, Nidia and her 6 younger children were relocated and placed in a house in good condition in Bogotá, the country's capital, with the aim of starting a new life away from the place where everyone knew them and would constantly remind them of what had happened. This is the last information that could be found about this family. And talking about Arcadio, the insufficient sentence was not even fully served. As in 2011, the authorities of that institution reported that Arcadio had died. According to a press release issued by the prison authorities 2 weeks before, the individual had been hospitalized for surgery due to gallstones. But the day after being discharged and returned to prison, the guards found him dead in his cell. The report stated that the death occurred due to natural causes. At the end of this case, the lesson of Nydia's courage and her struggle to provide for her surviving children remained. But the undeniable pain of so many years and the deaths of 6 little ones, either because their pregnancies did not come to term or due to being born under inadequate conditions, was undoubtedly very difficult to overcome. At the time of the events, the director of the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare stated that he had never known a case of this magnitude in Colombia and expressed concern that a situation of so many years had not been denounced by anyone. The official was not only referring to a complaint from the victim, who was the most fragile and had the least opportunity to do so, but also to the community members who knew about the situation but chose to remain silent. In a conversation with the press, one of the sons who stayed with the father tried to make sense of the events from his humble point of view. But the truth is that nothing justifies what happened in this case. Nydia lived for about 30 years dreaming for freedom, but without the courage to obtain it, as the abuse started at such a young age that it left her unable to defend herself. Inside, she was a terrified child, even at the age of 30. After finally being freed from her abusive father, the woman stated that all that went through her mind was the hope that her children could have a better future, that they would study to progress in life, form their homes, and feel at peace. And perhaps the great lesson of this case is advice for other women that Nydia repeated several times to the media. She pointed out that if they found themselves in a similar situation, they should find a way to speak out, to denounce, and trust in God to move forward. For Nydia, silence was her father's perfect accomplice, not just her own silence, but that of all those who, knowing the situation, preferred to look the other way. And that's the end of today's case. As always, I appreciate your support for my work. If you subscribe, like, and share this video, it will help me continue creating content. This was another episode of Unreal True Crime. See you soon. From the outside, John Parker's life in upscale Crown Point, Indiana appeared to be picture perfect. Married with kids, he and his wife Judy ran a very successful business selling Kirby vacuums, but appearances can be deceiving. On April 17, 2003, Judy called 911 to report that John had been shot outside their car. She told authorities she heard 2 gunshots and saw an unidentified figure in black ran from the scene. Little is known about the early life of John Parker. It's scarcely mentioned that he was born in 1970, had at least one sibling, and lived in Indiana, United States. He came from a middle-class family and was always an entrepreneurial young man with a desire for independence, self-improvement, and a hunger to take on the world. Therefore, it's not surprising that immediately after graduating from high school, he sought ways to earn money and, according to his brother, his first job was as a waiter's assistant in a restaurant, though he didn't last long there. For reasons unknown, John became angry at work and quit. However, this did not deter his ambitions, and sooner rather than later, he found a new job that not only allowed him more independence in his tasks, but also led him to discover his true calling: sales. John began working as a door-to-door salesman for Kirby vacuum cleaners. Initially, his family mocked him, but in a short time, John proved to everyone that he had found his direction in life. In fact, by the end of his first year, he was practically the company's #1 salesman in the area and announced he wouldn't settle for just that. Working long hours from 12 to 16 hours a day, he became not only a sales leader whose achievements were recognized at company meetings, but also a guide for other salespeople who found new ideas, inspiration, and a role model in him. It was during this time that he met 20-year-old Judy, a young girl who was born in October 1969 and lived in Texas in a low-income family of 3 children. She was very outgoing, and even though John was not looking to hire more salespeople at the time, Judy convinced him that she was the best in the sales field. Despite her young age, she was not a shy girl. In fact, she was a fully grown woman who, with her parents' consent, had married at 14 and was divorced with 2 children, Christina and Daniel Hicks, by the time she met John. John decided to give this determined applicant a chance and became her mentor in vacuum cleaner sales. Judy not only earned a place in the sales force led by John, but also won the heart of her boss, and sometime later they embarked on a romantic relationship. John's life could not have been better. He had a well-earned reputation as an excellent salesman and trainer, and also had Judy's support in life and work. With these foundations, he decided to start his own business in Michigan, becoming a sales and service operator for Kirby vacuum cleaners. He also offered training sessions for salespeople, passing on his personal secret and the enthusiasm that had made him a star in the sector. His company was recognized as one of the top in the area, and John always highlighted that he had achieved this success thanks to Judy's support. In 1992, with his professional life resolved, the couple got married, and in the following years, they dedicated themselves to demonstrating what a good salesperson could achieve in life. The couple had 2 daughters, Tiffany and Erica, bringing the number of children in the family to 4. They moved residences several times, always to better locations, and the children began to enjoy the benefits earned through the hard work of John and Judy. Initially, he had no issues with his wife's children. Christina was a sweet little girl, and Daniel was somewhat hyperactive and mischievous. The Parkers enjoyed a good home, excellent schools for the children, high-end cars, and frequent vacations. John was amassing a significant fortune and didn't want to hide it. On the contrary, he used it as an incentive for the young salespeople he trained, showing them what could be achieved through hard work. However, as time passed and Judy's children entered their teenage years, problems began. Christina's choice of friends was terrible, as she chose those with the worst behavior and engaged in drinking with them. Allegedly, according to some sources, she also used drugs. Meanwhile, 13-year-old Daniel was not on a good path either and seemed to be angry and poorly accompanied all the time. On one occasion, while with a group of friends, Daniel took John's car and drove around the neighborhood, destroying many of the mailbox posts. The next day, John went from house to house paying the owners for the damage caused to prevent them from reporting the boy to the police. Around this time, John was also called to his stepson's school to receive a complaint about the boy's bad behavior. It appears that on this occasion, John ended up hitting the young man, which of course generated tension in the relationship. After 9 years together, Judy finally took her family to Texas so they could see the humble place where she had grown up and meet one of her brothers who still lived there. During this trip, Judy complained to her brother that her marriage was failing and that John mistreated her children. The truth was that Judy, far from recognizing that her older children were on the wrong path, sided with them, which of course heated up what seemed to be a pressure cooker. If everything was already bad, things worsened when John began to suspect that his wife was being unfaithful with an employee of his company. True to his way of solving problems, John was not a man to sit and stew over a problem, but a man of action. To leave no room for doubt, he installed cameras in various parts of the office and finally obtained irrefutable proof that confirmed his suspicions. At that moment, John's world collapsed, and his previously cheerful and cordial behavior took a 180-degree turn. He began to drink, and under the influence of alcohol, he not only had terrible arguments with Judy but also became rough towards his children. His daughter Tiffany received a beating with a belt when her teacher informed her father that she had not brought her homework to school. When the teacher saw the marks from the beating the next day, she called social services to report the incident. Before they arrived, John made it clear to the four kids that if they wanted to continue enjoying the luxurious life they had been living up to that moment, it was better to say nothing about the beating. Indeed, Tiffany blamed her stepbrother Daniel for what had happened, and he did not deny it. However, John's bad mood didn't only affect his family. His employees and even the company's clients suffered from the betrayed husband's outbursts of rage. Seeking to put distance between his wife and her lover, he decided to move the family to an exclusive area in Crown Point, Indiana. Despite still being in love with Judy and hoping that by removing her from temptation they could have a fresh start, things did not improve. While Judy began to improve her appearance by losing weight and changing her look, John let his beard grow, started smoking, his wardrobe was reduced to jeans, and he was constantly distracted. The business suffered as a result of his state, ending up almost bankrupt and having to sell his boat to stay afloat. Rumors circulated in the office that Judy was having an affair with Jeff, John's right-hand man. Though it was unclear if the rumors were true, they undoubtedly fueled more disagreements. At a certain point, Judy informed him that she had decided to divorce, but it wouldn't be that simple. John felt that he had given everything to his wife, pulled her out of poverty, accepted her children, showered her with luxuries, and above all, loved her to the point of idolatry. With that same passion turned into resentment, he began to cut off all his wife's sources of money. He made it clear that if she left, she would leave with nothing, and his secret weapon was the recording of her infidelity with the office employee. This was the scenario at the beginning of 2003, and of course, the tensions between the couple affected the children, whose behavior went from bad to worse. Even Tiffany spent the holidays grounded because she and a friend had started a fire on school grounds. The end of the arguments came on Thursday, April 17, 2003, when John and Judy went out to dinner alone at a restaurant, possibly trying to find a solution to their situation, or maybe just trying to tone down the confrontation. After dinner, they called home to check on the kids and announced they would return shortly. At that moment, Christina asked them to stop by the office because she had left a school notebook there. Leaving the restaurant, they headed to the company, and John took the opportunity to bring the leftover dinner to Jeff, who was supposedly working late. The couple arrived at the office in a deserted industrial area just before 10 p.m. Both entered the office while John talked to Jeff. Judy picked up her daughter's notebook and returned to the car parked outside. Minutes later, John came out of the office and opened the rear door on the driver's side to search for something in the vehicle, when suddenly two loud bangs were heard and John collapsed on the parking lot floor. Instantly, the 911 received calls from Judy and the other from Jeff. As routine in such cases, police and medical assistance units arrived at the scene within minutes. Unfortunately, John, 33 years old, had been shot in the back of the head and was declared dead on the scene. Upon interrogating Judy, who was inside the car at the time of the incident, the woman could practically contribute nothing. She stated she was sitting there when her husband came out of the office, opened the back door on the driver's side, and immediately heard 2 detonations. Judy recounted that her reaction to hearing the shots was to hide, protecting herself with the seat, and when she lifted her head, she only managed to glimpse what seemed to be a man in dark clothing running away from the car. John's wallet was missing, so at first glance the incident seemed to have been a robbery, but the more the scene was analyzed, the more doubts arose in the investigators' minds. No one besides the couple knew they were going to be there, so a series of questions were formulated. Why would someone be looking to commit a random robbery in an industrial area that had no people in circulation at night? If it had been a robbery, why did they first take his life and only then stripped him of his wallet when in plain sight John was wearing a $20,000 gold Rolex and other easily accessible jewelry? Why hadn't the thief searched the pockets as criminals usually do in these kinds of assaults? More questions than answers. 2 bullet casings were found at the scene of the attack. This matched Judy's account of hearing 2 detonations. One of the shots ended John's life almost immediately, and as for the other, there was no official information. With their heads full of questions, the investigators began their work, and of course, the first person they took a statement from was Judy. She claimed that sometime before, her husband had had a heated argument with an employee of his company and identified the man. Beyond this, Judy could not provide anything more of interest beyond what she had said at the scene of the incident. Jeff was also not helpful. He was inside the office, and when he came out upon hearing the detonations, everything was already over. Meanwhile, the authorities contacted the Parker residence, and the call was answered by Christina, who was informed that her stepfather had passed away. With the robbery motive almost ruled out, detectives turned their focus towards John's circle, starting with the allegedly resentful employee. The man confirmed they had a significant argument but said it had been amicably resolved. Moreover, he had an alibi that was investigated and verified. The investigation then expanded to nearly everyone close to the young businessman: business partners, past and current employees, competitors, and even John's friends and family. The only slightly suspicious finding was the interaction between the widow and the company's general manager, but there was no substantial evidence. Judy's demeanor during her husband's funeral was very intriguing. Comments mentioned Judy appearing cheerful and socializing with friends, in stark contrast to the expected mourning behavior. Her ex-husband, the father of her 2 children, was also noted to be comfortably reading a newspaper at the funeral. 4 days after John's murder, Daniel, 15, was brought in for questioning on suspicion of involvement. This suspicion was based on an incident 6 months prior, where police were alerted by gang members that Daniel had paid them to kill his stepfather, John. Although they said they never intended to follow through and had merely kept the money, the police deemed the story implausible, confiscating the money and filing a report without apparent further action. However, given John's eventual murder, investigators revisited Daniel's potential involvement. Under interrogation, Daniel confessed to paying individuals to harm John, intending not to kill but to injure him, like breaking his legs. Despite detaining one of the youths Daniel allegedly negotiated with, he was released due to a solid alibi verified by the investigation. Daniel was released after 9 days due to lack of substantial evidence and his minor status. Later, it was revealed that John had issues with Judy's children, leading to more investigation into Daniel and bringing to light suspicions about Judy's daughter, Christina, 17. Christina denied everything when questioned, and like before, the alleged plan led nowhere. Given that both teenagers had shown a desire to eliminate John, investigators wondered where the money for these schemes was coming from, suspecting Judy as the only possible source. Further inquiries revealed that the relationship between the couple had significantly deteriorated prior to John's death, with at least one of Judy's affairs coming to light. However, sources indicated that John had no intention of leaving his wife and was seeking ways to salvage the relationship. The primary motive for Judy to target her husband appeared to be financial, with detectives discovering John had 2 life insurance policies totaling $1 million. Judy had attempted to claim this money after her husband's death, but the insurance company initially refused to pay, citing the ongoing investigation into his death. The payment was further complicated by John's father, who suspected Judy's involvement in his son's demise. Despite these leads, the case eventually stalled, with only circumstantial evidence available. Life moved on, but significant changes occurred within the Parker family household. Judy was hardly ever home, apparently busy with her new partner Jeff, John's trusted manager. In her absence, the older siblings took care of their younger half-sisters, Tiffany and Erica. Months later, Judy and Jeff decided to move out of state with John's younger daughters, while Daniel went to live with his biological father. Christina remained in the house, now pregnant and with a boyfriend. Though the investigation had hit a dead end, authorities kept the case open, regularly revisiting the files in hopes of finding something substantial. Their persistence paid off when, following a new lead, they interrogated some schoolmates of Christina and Daniel, who admitted to selling them a firearm. This information led detectives to investigate a piece of family-owned land used by Christina for shooting practice. Upon inspecting the area, investigators indeed found several bullet casings. These findings were analyzed in laboratories, and a significant clue was discovered. The bullet casings matched those from John's crime scene. In 2007, additional information emerged through a colleague, a narcotics officer who had been tracking Christina's ex-boyfriend, involved in a drug case and arrested. Seeking leniency in his case, the ex-boyfriend disclosed a conversation with Judy, in which she mentioned that it was her son Daniel who had fired the shot that ended John's life. Confronted with this information, 21-year-old Christina, linked to the weapon used in the crime, quickly began to talk. She admitted to purchasing the weapon and calling her parents on the night of the incident, asking them to stop by the office under the pretense of picking up forgotten homework. She confessed to being part of a plan to kill John, with her brother Daniel designated as the shooter. When 19-year-old Daniel was located and detained in Arizona, he was presented with the new ballistics evidence and his sister's account. He readily admitted to being the one who shot John, but claimed that Judy, their mother, was the mastermind behind the plot. Daniel disclosed that Judy had forged company checks to gather the necessary funds to hire hitmen to kill John. The amount stolen was reportedly $7,500. However, when the initial plan fell through because the hired individuals took the money without completing the job, Judy allegedly instructed them to purchase the weapon for her son to use instead. Furthermore, Daniel revealed it was Judy's idea to create the pretext for leaving the house that night by making the call about the homework. He stated he shot John once in the head, and the second shot was an accidental discharge while he was rifling through John's pocket for his wallet, following his mother's instructions. He was also told to return home without alerting his younger sisters, a task facilitated by Christina, who kept the girls occupied with television. The siblings claimed their mother had convinced them to commit the crime by alleging they were victims of abuse by John and promising them a better life with more money and freedom. It was also revealed that this was not Judy's first attempt to kill her husband. She had previously tried to poison his food, leading only to a brief hospitalization for John under the guise of food poisoning. By the end of 2007, Christina and Daniel were formally charged with murder and conspiracy. Christina pleaded not guilty to the conspiracy charge and was released on bail several months later in March 2008. Daniel, then 20 years old, pleaded guilty to a conspiracy charge to kill his stepfather and made a deal to admit his guilt and implicate his mother in the crime. In exchange for his cooperation, the prosecution agreed not to charge him with the more serious offense of murder, although he would still face a sentence of 20 to 25 years in prison. Daniel claimed that nearly a year before the incident, when he was 14, his mother and sister first asked him to help kill John. He detailed that his mother gave him and his sister money to buy a pistol, as well as providing him with black clothing, gloves, and a mask to wear on the day of the crime. She also instructed him on what to do to carry out the grim task, including taking a thorough shower upon returning home to eliminate any traces of gunpowder. Ultimately, Judy took responsibility for disposing of the weapon, the clothes worn during the crime, and her husband's wallet. Facing the inevitable in July 2009, 6 years after her husband's death, Judy surrendered to the authorities and agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, acknowledging her role in planning, executing, and covering up the crime. The prosecution requested that she be sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 28 years and a maximum of 35 years. Judy, nearing 40, was sentenced to 33 years in prison in late August 2009. The following month, Daniel was sentenced to 23 years. And in early October, Christina, who eventually pleaded guilty to aiding a criminal, received a 5-year sentence. Press reports indicate that Daniel was released in 2017 after participating in a community transition court program and chose to live a low-profile life thereafter. Christina served 4 years of her sentence and was released in 2013, but tragically, she died from a drug overdose shortly after her release. This case is marked by greed. Despite Judy's difficult early life and later success, her insatiable desire for more led her to commit heinous crimes. Sadly, her actions not only destroyed a successful entrepreneur, but also profoundly impacted her 4 children, leading 2 to prison and leaving the younger ones without their father and mother. Once again, dear audience, I thank you for your company. If you haven't subscribed yet, I warmly invite you to do so and become part of this great community. This is Unreal True Crime. Until our next episode, good night.